Greetings, friends! Juan Angryski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War Update for the week of September 9th through September 14th of 2025. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War Updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment, share this video around. Keeping amazing. And this week, we're going to start right in the Prosyana direction, formerly the South Donetsk direction, because this week, the biggest news of the week is that the entire South Donetsk area has been liberated. We're pretty confident with that, we could say that. And not only that, now the Russians are bursting into the Pokrovsk Oblast, and there seems to be nothing stopping them. But so we're going to talk about kind of this Prosyana direction. We talked about this before, about what the Russian plans here might be, but let's talk about what actually happened. So first of all, let's talk about this area, which was the biggest area of the gains. And this week, the Russians have taken complete control of the village of Sosnivka. Last week, they were right on the outskirts of it. After they took Novoselyivka, Shiva, Vornia, and they were kind of coming down here, and they finally fully took Sosnivka and took a bunch of. There's this trench area that's up here that they took as well. So the Ukrainians retreated back to one of a fortified area in Velika Mikhailivka here. And not only that, they've also captured a bunch of these, tree lines that are to the south of it as well. So yeah, the battle for Sosnivka started this week and ended this week with the Russians taking it fully. But not only that, the one, and then obviously, as we talked about last week, we talked about how because of the Russians were entering Sosnivka, how the Russians took Zaporizhia, that the village of Ternove was kind of caught into this kind of encirclement almost in this pincer. And I said I would not be, it's not in a doubt in my mind that Ternove would have fallen. Well, that was completely vindicated because the Russians also completely took the village of Ternove, coming at it from multiple directions, from the south, from the east, from the north, and just completely shutting it. Not only that, the Russians also did another major attack, which led them to entering the village of Novomykolaievka and having them raise their flags all over this area, which was a complete shock to me. I thought they would maybe take Beresova first, but it looks like they were able to push the Ukrainians out of here. And yeah, and not only that, they also managed to fully take Obratna because of this push down here, and they're able to hold themselves along this kind of like a row of water reservoirs here. And not only that, now it seems one of the main focuses of the offensive here is, now that they've liberated the South Donetsk area and they're now pushing towards Prosyana, the main area for right now is this village of Berezovo. This would be this is the biggest village in this kind of area, which is just a lot of it's just a bunch of open fields. And so taking like a big village, even if, objectively it might not be like a huge thing, but if you compare this to say, Novomykolaievka, right? Or Zaporizhia, right? This is a pretty decent sized, with some high, right? Like a few big buildings and such. So this is an area where Russians could accumulate forces and have a forward operating base in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. So right now, a lot of, we have the Russians already in the south here. I wouldn't be, the Russians are obviously going to continue pushing towards the village of Kalintsevsky to take it, along with Stepovo. The Russians are already clearing these fields that are to the south of Sosnivka. And so the town of Berezovo is already in pincers. And some pro-Russian sources are saying that they already pushed the Ukrainians out of it and that they've taken it. We don't have the official confirmation yet, but I wouldn't be surprised that within a day or two we see the village of Berezovo taken. And I actually wouldn't be surprised that by the time we talk next week, that the Russians fully take everything in this area and have their positions here. And so at first I thought the Russians would stop here and then they would focus north. I think the Russians might try to focus on trying to take Velika Mikhailivka just so they can have a position on the other side of the Volga River. They're going to be able to infiltrate it through maybe putting forces in Novoselyivka and entering this forest. This would give them very good cover from FPV drones, and then they're able to enter Velika Mikhailivka from this direction. They could also try to as they push a bit more to the west, try to reach these kind of ravines here. They could try to push towards the village of Aristotopol here. Try to take this little village that's to the south of the Volga River. The Ukrainians are going to blow up all the bridges that are here, but that the Russians could obviously create how do you say it? Wooden they can make these artificial bridges, and then they could start going into Velika Mikhailivka. And as you can see, there's not really much where the Ukrainians could accumulate. There's Pokrovsk obviously, but everything between Pokrovsk and Velika Mikhailivka is just some small villages. It's gonna be very hard for the Ukrainians to assemble forces to try to knock the Russians out of here, especially with a bunch of these villages that are closer that the Russians could use to keep pushing into Velika Mikhailivka. So that was my first guess was the Russians would hold positions here and then maybe push towards Verbova, push towards Alexivki, and then the main thrust would be towards Velika Mikhaivka. But it seems like the Russians are just doing a full push everywhere because a bit more to the south here, the Russians have also captured all these fields between Obrotnia and Ledina, took a bunch of these areas right here. And so right now they're actually right on the outskirts of the village of Nova Ivanovka here. So the village of Nova Igorivka and Nova Ivanovka are these two kind of outskirts villages that are hold the outskirts positions of this giant Uspenovka defense network that's right here. And I thought the Russians would not, as you can see, between the Spenovka and kind of the Russian positions in, say, Berestovo, which is where they're focusing, is, there's just some empty fields, and it's going to be very hard for the Russians to, I guess, push towards Uspenovka here, because as you can see, it's behind the Yancha River, so they have a river defense along with this. There's, there's also this kind of area that they could hold on. So it's the thing is that drones are the biggest defense thing for the Ukrainians, and it's going to be very hard. And I thought they would pause here and just kind of maybe try to outflank it from the north here, but it looks like the Russians are actually pushing towards this area. We need more confirmation, but if we see the Russians taking Novi Gorivka and Novi Ivanovka, that does show the Russians do probably have some plans, to push towards Uspenovka. So we shall see if the Russians continue pushing towards that. But yeah, so that's and then when I say the south Donetsk direction was liberated, most mappers are now, besides the most pro-Ukrainian ones, but most mappers are now saying that the villages of Zlonohai and Andriivka-Kletselovo have been completely liberated from the Ukrainians, and that basically almost everything behind the Vochka River is either fully taken or maybe the Russians aren't right up against the river in this area, right? Because the Ukrainians are in Ivanovka, but basically there's no Ukrainians on the other side of the Vochka River here, and so. Because of the, and we also had a video of the Russians walking around in the southern part of Andriivka Kletselovo. So it does show and so most mappers are saying that Zlonohai and Andriivka Kletselovo has been taken. Now maybe the Ukrainians do another counterattack to try to push the Russians out. Again, we need to basically wait a little bit to see if the Ukrainians do any shenanigans here. I do think maybe they're going to try to just hold up positions in Gorovka and Ivanovka and hold positions on the other side of the river. But yeah, that's just something that needs to. But yeah, that's why I'm saying that South Donetsk has been liberated. Now we call it the Prosyana direction, based off this one. This is one of the main will be one of the main kind of centers of the offensive. Yeah. So yeah, Zlonohai and Andriivka Kletselovo seems to be back under Russian control, and we shall see if they're able to actually put forces there to hold off any sort of Ukrainian counterattack. Because hopefully it wasn't just they entered there and they just did nothing. Hopefully they're reinforcing these two towns and holding, being able to hold this area right here from the Ukrainians. So we shall see how that develops. And then a bit here, in this kind of up northern part, in the village of Dachne and Filia. Remember, the Russians claim they take Filia and Dachne, but every single day we see the Ukrainians try to attack. We see the Russians, attacking back here. So it seems like these Filia and Dachne, this kind of southern area, is in this kind of more of a gray zone. I don't think anyone really holds this. So I do think the southern part is a bit of a gray zone. The Ukrainians are kind of more towards Novopalovka itself and such. But yeah, so that's something to talk about there. But yeah, that's the Prosyana direction. Now we're going to talk in the Zaporizhia direction, which I kind of combine because they kind of, obviously as the Russians push here, they're entering the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts, and Zaporizhia usually is one of those quiet sectors, so usually I combine that, but it's not too quiet. It's not like Kherson where we never talk about it. But there is some stuff that happens here. And this week, the Russians have very good gains near Stepanhursk. And this week, we had 100% confirmation that the Russians are in complete control of what they call the 3rd district of Stepanhursk, this kind of citadel here. This gives the Russians a very strong defensive position to hold off any Ukrainian counterattacks. And, as we see, and also not only that, we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this area right here. And some pro-Russian sources say they're, securing themselves. Sorry, I'm tired this morning. Anyway, they're securing themselves in this southern streets in the center part of Stepanhursk. As you can see, this center part has a bunch of high-rise buildings, so this is where the Ukrainians are going to be holding off the Russians. But if the Russians could somehow break into one of these high-rise buildings and start putting the squeeze on it, I do think they have a good chance of taking Stepanhursk, especially now we had confirmation of the Russians being in these suburbs here. So I do think the Russians will take something like this. maybe also this power plant right here. Not power plant, it looks like it's like a solar plant almost. But anyway, take something like this. Now, a lot of pro-Russian sources say that once they take that, they want to continue moving towards the village of Promoski, Vasily and reach this canal. Because if they could reach this canal here, this is not only a for the Konovka River. This would give them they would be able to put Zaporizhia under FPV drone control. Because from here to Zaporizhia, at least up to here, is 20 kilometers, which is the average range for an FPV drone. But there's definitely drones that could go further. And the main thing here is that they'll be able to start targeting these highways that lead out of Zaporizhia, and this would allow. But the thing is that I think if they want to continue pushing towards this canal here, they need to do something about the rear here. The Russians can't just keep pushing, towards this canal, because then they have this giant. Let's say they take what they want, take something like this. If they do that, then as you can see, this makes a giant, like bulge here, and the Ukrainians get attacked from these areas here. So I think if they want to continue pushing there, they need to start pushing maybe towards Luka-Lenishki, Pavlovka, and try to flatten this front a little bit here, and then then they could have something like this going on, and then this would give them a better position here, and then from here, I think instead of then not only will they be able to FPV drone Zaporizhia, they'll be able to put the main highway under FPV drone control, and then I think they should then start focusing on trying to take a Rekov, but that's still a little far away. But first, the main goal is Stepanhersk, and we shall see how that develops. But yeah, so taking that Stepanhersk citadel is a very good gain for the Russians, and we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're gonna go. Oh man, I'm really tired this morning. I don't know why. I slept for 10 hours actually. I slept a long time. But yeah. Anyway, now we're gonna go to the Pokrovsk direction. This is where we usually start, but we didn't this week. But we're gonna now talk about it. And this week, not actually much happened in Pokrovsk. Lots of battles. Let's be clear. A lot of battles are happening. And the thing about it is that because there's so much huge clashes here, is that neither side is really gaining an advantage. There's not really much changes happening, but there's a lot of battles going on. This week there's been some more geolocations that give us a more better idea what's going on. So let's talk about them. Let's talk about more in the north here. We had geolocate confirmation that the Ukrainians have taken back the village of Volodymyrivka and Shakova. And Ukrainian sources are saying they're making Pandivka and Mayaka in the gray zone. Obviously, if they do that, this is if they could take these two villages back, and if they are in control of Nikolorivka. Remember, pro-Russian sources saying that this is still under Russian control. But if they are in control of these villages, then this would allow them to actually cut this entire salient. But right now, most sources are saying that Pandivka, Mayak, and Nikolorivka are still under Russian control. But this is probably where the Ukrainians will focus. And it does seem like most mappers are saying that they've taken a bunch of these fields around Volodymyrivka, at least on the southern parts here. And the main thing for the Russians is that they have to hold off the Ukrainians from trying to reach Novotoretska here. That is one of the main logistics bases for this entire area. So they have to hold off the Ukrainians from reaching here. But some more geolocated confirmation shows that the Russians are still in these fields to the east of Sofivka and Sofivka. In these areas here, they were getting bombed. So it does show that the Russians still have some potential in these fields to the north here. But it does show that the back and forth is very precarious here. We also, I think maybe this was last week, but we did get we had a geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in Novoshakova, so that proves that they're there. So yeah, so that's what's happening in this northern part. Nothing, it's still a back and forth, and neither side has improved their positions where they could start saying they could breathe a sigh of relief. They're both still struggling to get their positions here. Now, a bit more to near Minograd, there is more. This is where the Russians are having better progress. Before, remember, we were seeing the Ukrainians doing counterattacks into Novokonomichnia. They did a big flanking maneuver towards Mirnia, and so we had this giant. Syriac has basically said everything from here is like a giant gray zone. And so, that could be the case. It could be that, but I do think that the Russians are in more control of this than they think. We had more geolocated confirmation coming this week. We talked about last week how the Russians were in this northern part. This week we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of southern part right here. So, I mean, if the Russians are, we keep seeing Russian positions around this kind of reservoir here, it does show that this raid into Novokonomichnia was more of a PR attack, and the Ukrainians weren't able to hold on to their positions here. So I do think the Russians are in control of Novokonomichnia, this substation, and this kind of Terrakon in this area right here. And so I do think the front line probably goes something like this. So behind this red line is probably is under Russian control, and the other thing is the Ukrainians are in control of it. So, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians maybe try to clear this area right here. There's a small little mine here. There's like these small little mines that are all over the east of Leningrad, and the Russians are slowly putting troops to storm them, just as they stormed this kind of main substation right here. But right now, that's just pressing Leningrad from the east, but the only way Leningrad's actually going to fall is if the Russians actually secure themselves in the north here and take Radinsky. But right now, the battle for Radinsky is on pause until the Russians could hold their positions here. The main thing the Russians have to do is to close this pocket, at least in Shakova, but if they could, in Teresk and Sofivka. If they could take something like this, that'd be a very big gain, and then they could hold on to their positions like this, then they'll be in a very good position. But right now, the Ukrainians are the ones pushing in. So since the Ukrainians put all their reinforcements here, it's going to be very bloody for the Russians to try to take out. We have had no more changes in the southern part. We don't know. We talked about the Russians entered Pokrovsk last week. We don't know what else they took this week, so we don't really know. A lot of Russian sources are saying that this area right here is where a lot of the fighting is going on, but we don't have any geolocated confirmation of that just yet. But we'll see how that develops. And then we have more confirmation that the Russians are in Udachne. We have the Russians being in these agriculture buildings to the north, so it does prove that they are here. And some Russian sources are saying they're actually trying to storm this now mine, and they're now clearing these fields to the east of this mine here. So we shall see if the Russians actually do try to storm this mine. Along with this, the Russians are now battling for Moravka as well. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the southern street here. This is going to turn out to be another, what was it called, Uspenivka, where the Russians and Ukrainians battle over this village for like 6 months. So, Moravka is the same thing because, they want to hold on to Moravka because if they lose Moravka, then there's only fields until Novopalovka, and they want to hold off the Russians here. But I don't think just as once the Russians took these villages that are to the south here, like Gorovko and Novoukrayinka, that they kind of stopped. So I do think that the Russians will probably take Moravka soon, but then they'll probably stop. So we shall see how that develops. But yeah, the battle for Moravka is still ongoing. And that's it. And then also in the southern part here, basically more clarification on the front line. The Russians have taken these fields around Novoukrayinka and then are probably in Chunashiva as well, but we actually don't know that, but we do know Novopalovka is still under full Ukrainian control, so we know that. But it seems that Novoukrayinka and Chunashi and these kind of fields around them is under Russian control. But anyway, that's the Pokrovsk direction. Now we're going to go to the Kostiantynivka direction, and this week there's only been some small changes again, mostly in this area. This week we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these fields to the north of Alexandra Kletselovo here. This does, and a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying that between Prosyana and Alexander Shutina is that they've liquidated this pocket. So yeah, I do think that the Ukrainians in this kind of pocket have been cleared out, and there's no more positions for them here. So I do think right now the Russians are trying to hold on to these trenches that were around Stupичki and Prosyana in this area, but the Ukrainians have been doing counterattacks to try to force the Russians out of the dachnas that are here. But there's these other set of dachnas that are more to the south, these garden dachnas as they call them right here, and we actually had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this area and trying to put up positions there. Now maybe the Ukrainians do another counterattack to push them out. But it does show that, in terms of these two dachnas, the Russians are trying to storm them in order to get some forward positioning into Kostiantynivka. But yeah, so once the Russians actually hold on to this, we could say the battle for Kostiantynivka has officially begun. But right now the Russians are just trying to clear these pockets around it to get a better position here. Along with this, we see that Klib and Belka is still being fought over. We have the Russians bombing, Ukrainians here, also on this kind of reservoir. So it does show that this reservoir pocket has not been liquidated as we thought. So yeah, it's going to be very hard. I don't know how the Ukrainians are still here, but But anyway, we also had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these kind of fields right on the outskirts of the village of Nipolivka here. The Russian Ministry of Defense said they took it, which makes sense, is on the other side of this river, so they could have taken it. But I do think that if the Ukrainians are still in Kyiv and Balka, I don't think the Russians are going to be pushing towards these suburbs of Konstantinivka anytime soon. So we shall see how that develops here. But yeah, what the Russians need to do is completely, actually fully secure themselves in this pocket here, and then also fully secure themselves on the other side of this area. And then from here, then they could start putting pressure on Konstantinivka. But we shall see how that develops here. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Seversk direction, and in the Seversk direction, there's been some small changes. No changes in the south. We still don't have more confirmation of Fedorovka or Prezhny being under Russian control, but we don't have Ukrainians claiming otherwise. So we're just still waiting and seeing. But in the north, the biggest changes is that even pro-Ukrainian mappers are saying that this kind of area that is to the north of Seversk, specifically like this area right here, is in this kind of gray zone, and that means the Russian forces are operating here, but they've not completely hold out. There's a few areas here, like this mine area right here, this kind of like area, these trenches that are to the north of, and these like kind of terracons here, and this area right here. These areas are kind of these like small little mining areas, like Dreamwood too. I think it's like a wood cutting place. But in any case, the these areas are probably being stormed by the Russians as we speak, but maybe the Russians aren't able to hold on to them. We also have more geopolitical confirmation that the Russians still already control of Sherobranka. We have the Ukrainians bombing them in the southern part of Sherobranka here. So if the Russians are still in Sherobranka, that does allow them a forward operating base to be able to, do raids into this area, into this area, into this area. So they have to capture these kind of small strong points in order to fully secure themselves in the northern part of Seversk here. But I think the Russians need to, do more operations to be able to actually secure themselves here. So we shall see. But right now the battles for the northern part of Seversk here. If the Russians are able to break into Yampil, which it seems like will be the next target, they'll be able to then cut off Dornovka, and then, this would be one of the main goals for the Russians, to take the village Dornovka. So that'll be a very big gain for the Russians if they're able to take it. And this would finally cut off Seversk from the north here. And then in the south of Seversk here, we had some more geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these tree lines that are south of Novoselivka, this area right here, and to the north of Vimka. So just a little bit more movement in this direction. But besides that, just some small changes in the Seversk direction. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction. In the Lyman direction, there's actually been a lot of changes. This is where, Lyman used to be kind of boring, but now it's actually pretty interesting. And this week, the main thing is the battle for Zaporizhia and Shenderkilovo. We talked about this last week, and this week they have not been captured, but they've been slowly picked apart. And this week, we had more geolocated confirmation. We had the Russians taking the northern part of Zaporizhia. We don't know if they took the whole northern part yet, but we had Russians raising the flags in the most northern part in these streets here, in this area right here. Just this kind of north-central part has not been confirmed yet, but I do think the Russians probably are in control of the northern part. We actually also had them raising their flags in the most central part of Zaporizhia in the education building and such. And then also besides that, we had, we obviously saw last week the Russians taking the south-central part. Now, we don't know about the most southern part of Zaporizhia with this area right here. But there's a bunch of trenches that are to the south of Zaporizhia in this area, and we don't know if the Russians have taken them. But so the most north-central part, and then the most southern part is still a question mark. But I have no doubt that probably the Russians will take Zaporizhia within a week or two. So that would be a very big gain. We talked about last week about what the Russians have plans for Lyman. But once Zaporizhia is taken, this gives them a position on the other side of the Zhirbrets River, and then they'll be able to go downwards and start pushing and crossing the river. Right now, we actually had a lot of mappers are saying the Russians have crossed the river and trying to storm the ostrich farm here, trying to get themselves some ostriches to storm Yampil. And if they could do that, they could then link up with the Russians that will be moving down from Zaporizhia, and from here they could then start battling for Yampil, which, as I said, would be very good for the Russians in Seversk, but also Yampil is the gateway for the southern part of Lyman, so the battle for Yampil is about to start. Along with this, one of the other battles going on is the battle for Shenderkilovo. This week, the only changes is some maps are saying that the Russians have taken more of this kind of southern part of Shenderkilovo. We talked about how they cut them off from the south here, and they're now moving kind of northwards, taking a few of these areas here. And they're taking these forests that are to the north of it, but the center part and most of Shenderkilovo is still under Ukrainian control, which I found kind of strange. Also, they're saying they're improving their positions around Sardinia, which I guess makes some sense. So, just Sardinia is what's cutting off Shenderkilovo from the north, and the Russians need to hold on to this little village from Ukrainian counterattacks to try to, that are trying to unblock Shenderkilovo. But anyway, they made some small progress into this town, but they have not captured it just yet. The Ukrainians are still battling for Retkadup, but we don't know if they've and this kind of area is still a little bit contested. We don't know exactly where the Russians are, where the Ukrainians are. We had the Ukrainians entering Novomykolaiivka, then we saw the Russians entering it. We saw the Ukrainians getting bombed in Reykjavik, but then we also had the Russians being in Glusha, Kulovo. So, this is a very fluid here, but the Ukrainians are definitely trying to break apart the Russian defenses in this northern area here, because if they could take Reykjavik and push towards Novi, this would very much threaten this entire operation here. So the Russians definitely need to, I think the Russian commander is so focused on storming Lyman that they're again neglecting this kind of they have to do some things before they actually could take the main prize. Instead, they cross the river here and then try to push towards Lyman. But it's if you want to take Lyman, you have to secure your northern flank here a little bit. But besides that, there's been that's basically the Lyman direction, and then in the Kupyansk direction, kind of the same thing with happening here is that they once they cross the Oskal River, they're like, oh, we're gonna now trying to storm Kupyansk, and yeah, they're in Kupyansk in the northern part, but it's going to be very hard for the Russians to it's going to be very easy for the Ukrainians to disrupt Russian logistics here, because they made a small little bridge here just enough so they can start storming Kupyansk. When, as I've mentioned in other videos, they had to take a bit more of these villages to have a more solid position here. Otherwise, it's going to be very easy to cut them off. So, but anyway, in Kupyansk itself, we had more geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians getting bombed in the center part of Kupyansk. It does show that the Russians claiming they were in the center part of Kupyansk is wrong, but we do have most mappers and even pro-Ukrainians are claiming they are in the northern part of and in Moskovka in the northern part of Kupyansk. And there's actually been something called the Kupyansk pipeline operation, where the Russians from their positions in Lyman Pershi cross this area and try to open themselves up in this area right here. So I do think the Russians probably should take Malosherbaki and Velika Sherbaki just to improve their positions here a little bit better, just so they could push the Ukrainians further out. But yeah, besides that, we already knew the Russians were in Kupyansk, but there's not really been that much changes here. And then there's been no changes in the Kharkov direction, and really no changes in the Sumy direction. Mappers have changed their positions that Nova Kostiantynivka is back under Ukrainian control, which makes sense. Now the only thing left is Kostiantynivka, which is a border town. So I think the Ukrainians right now are focused on taking back Kostiantynivka and Alexivka, but it seems like the Ukrainians withdrew a bunch of troops here, and now both sides are kind of not pushing anywhere here. So yeah, I think Nova Kostiantynivka was just something that was just taken, but then withdrawn. It was a bit of a gray area. I do think things like Stepova and Nova Kostiantynivka are just kind of more of a gray zone, because the Ukrainians don't want to get very close to the international border. But because a lot of these villages on the international border are just small little villages and they don't really matter. But but yeah, besides that, there's not really been that much changes in the Sumy direction. Alrighty, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update. This has actually been it was supposed to happen last week, but I forgot to mention it. But this is the 2-year anniversary for this channel making these videos. So hopefully we shall see how this war develops in the next 2 years. Alrighty, be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and keep being amazing. So aim high and wander on.